So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the brass tacks of what the fight was and what we did with the building, and then I think Alvaro is going to talk a bit about his experience and kind of the effect of being in occupation and what that was like. So yeah, the context of the occupation was basically, it was 2011, the coalition government had just come in. For a lot of young people at university, that was the first experience of a Tory government, the first kind of experience of that like sharpening of class warfare that happens when Tories get in power. And more specifically, that coalition government was trying to bring in fees. Obviously they didn't have the power to bring in fees in Scotland, but the effect was going to be that there would be fees for students from England and Wales at Scottish universities, and the student body in Glasgow was kind of organising to resist that. As well as that, they were trying to take away the educational maintenance allowance, which still exists in Scotland, but in England has gone now, and that was 20 or 30 quid that you got a week for attending school after the age of 16. So those were the kind of key like national things, and obviously broader than that was just the kind of ideology of austerity that was coming in and trying to organise and explain to people that the ideas that it was just that too much money had been spent and there was no money left was not the reality of the crisis. The more immediate context was that at Glasgow University there was a new Chancellor, he's still the Chancellor, Anton Muscatelli. And he'd come in, he'd awarded himself a massive pay rise. I think he was on something like 140 grand a year at the time. And he'd decided he was going to cut nursing, he was going to cut modern languages, he was going to cut continuing education, he was going to cut a lot of the things that still remained at Glasgow and still made it an institution that offered something to the city. That's something obviously that universities have done less and less and less of. So there were redundancies coming in through that, and there was, on top of that, the closure of the Hetherington Research Club. So it's been great to hear kind of about these overlapping stories of occupying factories, occupying places where we live, occupying places for leisure. We had the luck to be occupying a pub, which made things a bit more fun. But yeah, the Research Club was a postgraduate bar and meeting rooms on the campus in a Victorian building that had, I think since the 1910s or 20s, been a kind of meeting place for staff and students to come together and discuss things and drink. And the university decided to remove its grant and to make all of the staff redundant. So we, as a student body, had organised various anti-cuts protests in the run-up to this, and eventually decided that we would launch what we called Operation Chiapas and take over the building. And it was really easy to take over the building because the staff had been made redundant, so we simply had to meet with them and get the keys. But obviously nothing starts with that. There'd actually been a kind of period of a year's build-up towards the occupation of kind of building trust in a group. There'd been groups such as Glasgow Against Education Cuts, the National Coalition Against Education Cuts, Students Against Cuts, and we kind of met more and more people that were willing to get on board with this till we had a kind of core group that were willing to go into occupation. And we actually occupied a different building first in November the previous year, which I would really recommend if you are planning a long-term occupation, is to have some practice, because that was an absolute shambles. It was basically just one night of fighting with security guards in a building that didn't have any heating, and then leaving the next morning. But yeah, and then the other thing I kind of wanted to mention was that of the students that were told, most were kind of 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and a lot of them had been involved, had been politicised at times like the Iraq War and the school strikes that were organised. A lot of people had walked out of school and helped organise that, but they'd also were occupiers that had been as children at the Pollock Free State and had kind of experienced that, had been children at the Govanhill Baths occupation and stuff, and so particularly among the Glasgow region occupiers there was a lot of experience of occupation and a lot of things we've talked about over the last couple of days, and how that kind of, as John Cooper said, if people have the information, if they have the idea that they can do these things, people are quite likely to take the initiative, and the kind of strength in knowing those stories. So yeah, who was in occupation? It was students, it was staff, it was students from across the universities in Glasgow. was also school kids. I remember someone's mum coming in to tell us that we were radicalising a 15-year-old boy who'd been occupying the building with us, even though he was just reading Mao. There were other activists, people from that got involved with the G8 stuff that had been not that many years before, people from Pod Free State, things like that. There were homeless people, there were members of the public, and there were groups of pretty much every political grouping that you'd find. That's another thing that I think has come up a lot over the last couple of days that for me was really powerful about being part of an occupation, was that maybe when you're kind of doing meetings and organising and thinking about theory and stuff, you get boxed into quite a small political faction sometimes, but when you're actually working to maintain a building and to defend something and build something, you inevitably end up working with anarchists and Trotskyists and whoever from whatever organisation. There was even some Lib Dems as part of the and I'm not saying that I think that left unity is necessarily worth pursuing, but I think that what occupations can help build is a kind of left trust and a kind of knowing that you can work with people across ideological divides on the left, and I found that powerful. And then the other aspect that was really important was being involved with the Accord Mums. So the Accord Centre in the East End was being closed and demolished to make way for the Commonwealth Games at the time, as was a load of housing where Mrs. Giaconelli ended up as the last holdout, and there was a lot of organising between the Heatherington and people resisting what the Commonwealth Games was doing to that part of the city. And I think at its best, the occupation was able to be a base for kind of meetings and recuperating and coming out to do things in the city. Those were our demands. It was basically a demand that the club would be reopened, that redundancies would be ended, and kind of broader demands that Glasgow University would become a place of lifelong learning for the residents of Glasgow. So what we got up to mostly was providing free meals, having a free shop, daily meetings, a bar at night, gigs and workshops and lectures. For me personally, it was a really powerful experience of having the likes of Jim Kelman and Tom Leonard and Liz Lockhead come in and talk and engage with the occupation, and kind of having that living tradition of working class art in the west end of the city coming into the university. On the 22nd of March, the university decided they'd had enough, and they sent Strathclyde police in to get rid of us. And that was kind of the making of the occupation, really. So they came in early in the morning, and they came in way too heavy-handed. I think there were actually only about 6 of us staying the night that night. Unfortunately, we haven't got a YouTube video of that. There's a great YouTube video of it's just called Hetherington Protesters Scuffle with Police. But what it is about 10 minutes of police dragging protester after protester out this front door into this crowd. But they haven't secured the back of the building, so everyone just goes around the back. See the same people dragged out 3 or 4 times. It obviously involved a large amount of the community, a large amount of the student body coming out and seeing how the protesters were being dealt with by the police in cooperation with the university. And I think it's always a radicalising thing to have a scuffle with the police, I think, and I think it did that for a lot of people in the occupation, and it really solidified the feeling among the people that were occupying. They cleared the building eventually, and the student body responded by marching up to the main building and occupying the tower. You can see a very young Dr. Ewan Gibbs in the corner there, who was supposed to be talking yesterday. But yeah, so we took over the tower and held that for a night, and then in response to that, we also had David Roberts playing on the balcony of the university that night. And in response, the university gave us back the Hetherington Research Room. And I think there's not been many times in my life where I've experienced that kind of immediate win. And another one is obviously Kenmure Street earlier this year. And I think there's something that just can't be underestimated about what it does to a group of people to find that power and to have an institution immediately relent and give you back what you were demanding. So the occupation carried on for another 4 months after that. There were some really great things about that. I think there were some really important connections built and some really important experiences, but inevitably I think the occupation was also an experience of stress and exhaustion and of the pressure of running a building, running a free kitchen, running a bar, trying to keep the space safe. And I think that's another aspect of occupation that I would kind of like to express at this, is that it can often become about maintaining the building, and that is a cost to the movement and a cost to what you're trying to do. And that definitely happened with Hetherington, but nevertheless there were some great legacies from it. It's the longest student occupation in this country's history. Lots of people that I still organise with across the city, such as Joey, who was just talking, and people I first met at the Hetherington. Student fees, I think, remain an untouchable issue in Scotland, and I think that's in part due to that student movement in those years. The educational maintenance allowance was maintained in Scotland. Things like the Kelvin Grove riot at the royal wedding, lots of fun events like that. I think were quite encouraging, and a lot of people that were then kind of cutting their teeth organisation in Hetherington went on to put their energies into things like Corbyn Project, the Radical Independence Campaign, kind of for better or worse. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of what the revolution was, and my friend Alvaro is now going to talk a bit about his experience there.
So the experience of the Hetherington occupation was life-changing for many people, pretty much, probably all people involved. So things like, for example, the extremely unusual way of getting the Hetherington back when we occupied the tower. Those are things that almost never happen, and when they happen, they are very powerful in showing you what's possible. But small things like running the Hetherington on the day by day, having these daily meetings, sometimes very exhausting, was a very alien but very inspiring experience as well. It will show you that the ideas we had, or at least I had, about these kind of meetings, about running these kind of collective projects, they were all full of prejudice, they were all completely wrong. Because when you see these things working, you see they're full of problems and they're difficult, and they don't happen, without effort. But all the things that you think are going wrong will not necessarily go wrong, and the amount of things you believe are possible grows incredibly. So many of the people who were involved started, we thought it was possible to do things, and for example, I started getting involved in migrant solidarity projects, and I've been running since 2012, more or less, till now, a food distribution project with no budget at all, with completely non-legit, we were registered as a community interest company for a short time, but most of the time we've been completely informal. But we've managed to keep some of the principles I kind of developed in the Hetherington occupation, like being always having the means reflecting the end, so never using methods that don't reflect what you want to get. So, for example, the horizontal way we were running the Hetherington, we were trying very, very hard to avoid hierarchy, to avoid a core group to impose their will on the others. So this kind of practical problems of organization, practical problems of government, I learned a lot in the Hetherington, and I was applying it after in this food project, that we're involving their users as much as we could, and trying to show them as well that they don't have to be the recipients of charity. They can take things in their own hands and do something collective in a collective way, kind of thinking outside of the box. We are shown that we kind of have to fit in this consume, production, work etc. Sell your labor kind of model. But there were other experiences as well that were life-changing in the Hetherington. One was that it was a hub for lots of very different people to bring their different projects. So Henry mentioned quite a few of the people who came to showcase what they were doing in terms of radical politics at the Hetherington. And then we got involved. That's the way I got involved in the solidarity, in the migrant solidarity projects. But others were also happening at the same time. However, the most, what I remember the most about the Hetherington is the day-by-day working together, for example, in the kitchen or tidying up or whatever, with someone we have very, very different ideological views on things, and how that became completely irrelevant in most of the cases, and we were very good to work together. We were working together very well. And when time came to the meetings where we had to kind of play our completely different approaches to things, so we really had to discuss something we disagreed on, was in a way quite solved by the fact that there were other points of view as well. And this massive effort we were doing to not impose the views of a minority on majority, these things would play out in kind of smoothing the conflicts between individuals and make everything kind of a more collective thing. So that was, before I was involved in the Hetherington, I would never think that was possible. Because my experience of radical politics were people like my parents were Maoists, for example, and people kind of having this petty fights on small points of their ideology and kind of sabotaging each other and all these things. But also, the way the university was being, when I came here, I came from a public university where the cultural life was very rich. So you would have your classes, you will go out, you will participate in meetings, you will participate in lots of kind of cultural rebellious activities. And you will stay in the university until it was late at night, and then you will go home. But when I came here to do my PhD at Glasgow Uni, I found that no one was doing that. The university was like a mall. You would go there, you would consume, and you would go back home. And I wasn't sure that it was like, that's what universities were in the first world. Or that's what the universities have become. However, during the Free Hetherington, I discovered that that was a model that was being imposed in universities worldwide, in some countries further than others. It was turning the universities into a business where students became customers, and you will go and pay for a very particular bit of knowledge you were giving it, you will take it home when you go. That was all. And Antonio Scatelli, the principal, was particularly transparent example of this kind of brand of managers, senior managers that were parachuted into universities to turn them into businesses. So when we were as the Hetherington occupation, we were negotiating with senior management. It was also very interesting to me to see what their outlook was on things, and how they were pretty much convinced that they were fighting for the well-being of students, that they saw students as customers. And then they would come and say like, oh yes, I've been approached by a student that was very worried about how this was disrupting his education experience or service, whatever they thought. So that was, negotiating with them gave us a very clear picture of what we were standing against, and made us, I think it was extremely good political education, and pretty much formed a whole generation of people that went on to do other political things. And we acquired kind of priceless education in how things were when we were in the Hetherington. So yeah, I don't know how things were before. I've heard of cases of universities becoming these kind of very vibrant hubs of radical activity, like Paris in the '68, or many other examples, or even what I experienced back in Colombia. But the Hetherington gave us the idea that that could pop up anywhere, because the university was a desert. It was like there was not much to do. I was a kind of senior student doing a PhD. It was kind of old for student ages. And there was not much to do for senior students. Everything was kind of marketed for very young students that would come and have this kind of, what would you call that? MTV show of student life where you would get drunk and then you would go and consume in the pub, you would go and consume in the classroom, you would go and do this kind of mall lifestyle, and not the kind of organic experience of a university that have happened elsewhere. So to resume, I would say that the experience of the Hetherington was expanding the universe of things we thought were possible, and show us how we can, it took an effort, but how is within our reach to produce things that were very, very different to society as we know it, and in a much better way, in a way we kind of can envision and we can impose collectively, though. Thank you.